Welcome to I Hate James Dobson, a podcast made by someone who feels overdone, hoping to outrun the potential hit and run of trauma.
Whoa.
I can do rhyming, too, not just alliteration.
That was some fancy wordsmithing you did there.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to I Hate James Dobson. This is Jake. This show always comes with a trigger warning, because we're talking about one of the main guys who tied together white evangelicalism and Christian nationalism under the auspices of child abuse rebranded as child rearing advice. But as you might imagine from the title of this episode, today comes with an extra trigger warning. We're going to be reading a book that is pretty openly misogynistic and transphobic, so themes of sexual assault and other forms of gender-based violence abound. As always, we do have plenty of laughs along the way, but please be sure to take care of yourself, including pausing or just skipping this episode if you need a break. But with that, let's take a moment, take a breath, and go on with the show. Welcome to I Hate James Dobson. My name is Jake. I'm a former evangelical turned queer sex therapist, and as always, I am joined by the gallant, the generous, and the gifted Brooke.
Whoa.
Hi, Brooke.
Hi.
Brooke, how are you doing?
I'm great, but how was your birthday? It's in the past.
Yes, it is my birthday tomorrow. As of recording, we'll probably go up until my birthday with recording.
I can't wait to celebrate.
So I don't know, but I'm going to a midnight screening of Rocky Horror Picture Show for my birthday.
That's so cute.
Yeah, at the Music Box Theater, which has the live organist before every show.
Wait, that's so fun.
Yeah.
Why didn't you invite me to that?
Because it was very spur of the moment, and the tickets sell out very fast.
Well, okay.
You're invited in my heart.
That's bullshit.
I'll be thinking of you the whole time. It meant nothing.
It's also bullshit.
Yeah. How was your birthday?
Good. But it was a long time ago.
I'm very bad with making the focus for me on my birthday.
Okay, wait. I want to talk more about the Rocky Horror Picture Show.
Mm-hmm.
Are you, what character do you identify with if you were a character from that show?
Rocky.
Oh, Rocky.
Yes.
I think sometimes people think it's just like Frankenstein and Frankenstein's monster. I think sometimes people think Rocky is Tim Curry, but that's not true.
I believe you mean Frankenstein's monster. What Rocky Horror Picture Show character are you?
Okay. I think externally, I'm Frankenfurter.
I see that.
I think internally, I'm Riff Raff.
I love that for you. I see that for you. Knowing you, that makes a lot of sense. I don't know that we've ever actually used my parents' names in this, but it's very funny that we refer to my parents as Brad and Janet.
Yeah, that is funny. That is, I do call them Brad and Janet. I don't think I ever connected that. That's why I was doing it.
Okay, so also Halloween this year is on a Thursday. I've had actually way too many thoughts about this. Do you celebrate Halloween the weekend before or the Friday, literally the next following day?
Well, that's tricky. I'm going to tell you my philosophy, but I don't know if this is the consensus of
This
the
is
world.
the Bible's truth.
Here's what me and Jesus do. I like to celebrate before and not after, because after I feel sad because in my heart I already know it's over.
Mm-hmm.
So like if my birthday is on a Thursday, I would actually probably celebrate the weekend before and that Thursday, and also my birthday's not a good example. I'd celebrate all month, but
I actually think that's a good example because my theory is people just don't want to celebrate Halloween in November.
Yeah.
Like whatever it is, whatever that mental block is, that's November. November's not Halloween anymore.
Yeah.
But all of October is Halloween.
Yeah.
All of October is spooky month.
That's right. I would want to celebrate the weekend before.
Mm-hmm.
And we just agree on that. And then maybe, you know what I would love to do? I would love to go to someone's house. Readers, if you're listening and you want to invite me over, please do. I would love to sit on a porch and pass out candy in an actual neighborhood with actual children who are trick-or-treating. Not like two randos that buzz the apartment. You know what I mean? Like, I didn't mean to call kids randos, but you know what I mean. Like, that's so like nostalgic and old-timey to me. My parents used to live in where they like shut the streets down for trick-or-treaters. There'd be like thousands and thousands of them.
Speaking of Halloween, it's the scariest time of the year, full of clowns, reanimated corpses, and horrors beyond comprehension. And that's just the United States Senate. You know what that sound means? That means it's election time.
Woo!
This podcast is explicitly political because James Dobson's religion is the Republican politics. We've seen that many times, from the hydra of organizations like the Family Research Council or the Alliance Defending Freedom to just the James Dobson Family Institute. We talked about that in our episode, What is James Dobson Up to Now? It has been said that when fascism comes to America, it will come wrapped in a flag and waving the cross. Dobson is a key figure in that fusion of nationalism and Christian identity. Dobson is at the vanguard of the Christian nationalist movement that preys on America like cancer. Our book today comes from this ideology. It's not an exhaustive list of the risks that we face should Trump win, but it is a horribly helpful case study in what we can expect. What's the book? Let me take you on a journey.
I don't want to.
You're here now. The whiskey's in the cup. In our episode, What is James Dobson Up to Now? I did a deep dive into his websites. And one interesting thing that I found that we didn't really discuss in the episode is his library. You can purchase Dobson's books online, as well as books deemed to be relevant to the James Dobson oeuvre. Now, I am morally opposed to paying for these horrible books. However, there is no set cost for these books online. There's a suggested donation, which kind of feels like a tax evasion thing to me. Doesn't matter. But you're allowed to change the fee. You cannot enter $0.0, but you can, however, enter $0.01. And so, for the sake of science, I ordered multiple books. And for the totality of my order, I was charged 1 cent. Meaning, I paid less than 1 cent for these books. Not 1 cent per book, 1 cent for all of them. And to me, that's about as free as I can get. Today's book was not written by Dobson. It was written by two people. Dr. Owen Strahan? It's unclear to me. Senior Director of the Dobson Culture Center and Provost and Professor of Theology at Grace Bible Theological Seminary in Conway, Arkansas. It was also written by some asshole named Gavin Peacock, former professional...
No, you're making these names up.
I wish I was.
Every episode you give me some weird name you've made up.
Gavin Peacock? It's really good. I could come up with something like that if I tried. He was a former professional soccer player in the UK and associate pastor at Calvary Grace Church of Calgary and director of international outreach for the Council on Biblical Manhood and Womanhood.
And a drag king down at the old...
Biblical manhood does sound like slang for...
Biblical manhood.
For like just an enormous schlong.
I feel like Gavin Peacock is such a drag king name, and Biblical Manhood is the club where he performs.
That's the act on Tuesday nights.
Not the Tuesday night act.
Well, you know, drag kings get fucked over.
Tuesdays at 6.
So this book, I learned while reading, is part of a trilogy, co-authored by these two people. It not only shows their deep hatred for minorities, especially queer people, but lays out a very dismal view for society, and one that they will fight to make hard a reality. These are the ghouls who have taken over Dobson's legacy. While Dobson is unhinged and evil, these people are completely unmoored from reality and are somehow even worse. It's kind of like a first Trump term versus a second one.
Ugh.
Our book today...
No, don't. Leave it in the backpack. I hate it.
Published in the year of our Lord 2020.
No.
What does the Bible teach about transgenderism?
Absolutely not.
In my notes, I've only been referring to it as the transgender problem because that's the vibes that it gives off.
Let me see. Oh, no. Oh, it's hardcover?
It's hardcover.
Oh, no.
It's not even worth the half cent or whatever that I paid for it.
Oh, God. It's a good feeling book.
Unfortunately. It's nice and small. It like fits in your hand really well.
It's really ASMR-y.
Look at the tabs.
Yeah, it's a lot of tabs, readers.
And a lot of what color tabs do you see?
The bright pinks and oranges. Oh, no. Oh, God. I love you so much. But this is actual torture. Okay, wait. The authors bring their wisdom and conviction to bear. Brilliant analysis. Like, get over it.
I'm actually really glad that you started reading those on the back, because I want to start there. I want to talk about the opening. And so in the first 7 pages of this book, before the acknowledgments, before the table of contents, there are 7 pages of those little blurbs for people like saying how good of a book this is. And there's some really interesting people that support this book. Albert Mohler, president of the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, who I hope rots in hell and feels every inch of it, a super powerful and influential person in the Southern Baptist Convention. Conrad Mbewe, a pastor in Zambia. And as far as I can tell, just like some guy, some pastor, he has like a radio show. In Zambia, it is a self-described Christian nation that outlaws homosexuality. So he likes the books. David Talcott, associate professor of King's College in New York. King's College had their accreditation revoked and closed in 2023. So
oh my God.
That's not a real place anymore. Tim Cantrell, senior pastor and president of seminary in Johannesburg, South Africa, which is also non-accredited. Colin J. Smothers, executive director for Council on Biblical Manhood and Womanhood, who is Gavin's boss or peer or whatever. And T. Dale Johnson Jr., executive director for the Association of Certified Biblical Counselors. This is going to make our first digression. Brooke, your specific license, you're a licensed professional counselor, yes?
Yes.
What is counseling? What is therapy? What be the difference? Because these are biblical counselors. These are counselors.
I will tell you the difference between... You're asking between therapists and counselors?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. What I was told, because it is... there's kind of a fine line. Therapist is like the umbrella term for people who do various kinds of... This is using a word to define a word, but therapy, right? So like a marriage and family therapist, a sex therapist, whatever, right? Like, so the therapist, it's sort of like the word queer. It's like the umbrella word. Mm-hmm. And then a counselor, which is what I am, but I'd like to remind everyone, I'm a licensed professional
We're going to get to that. That's a very important caveat.
So maybe instead of explaining the difference, what I'd like to tell you is what I had to do.
Yeah,
So
please.
I had to go to several years of graduate school. Mm-hmm. I had to take specific required classes. Mm-hmm. I had to pass a national counseling exam.
That's important.
Yes. I will take another exam soon that I have to pass to get my final credential. Mm-hmm. And, obviously, had to pass all my classes and all these things, which I did with honors.
Damn right you did.
And I have to follow the ethical standards laid out by the Counseling Association.
So interesting you bring that up. We talked about this a little bit a couple episodes ago. I have nothing but antipathy for biblical counselors, pastoral counselors in this way. Not because I feel like spirituality has no place in therapy. Actually, I think pretty strongly the opposite. People have a very strong spiritual drive, and that's important to talk about in therapy. But the people that I am against are the people who are unlicensed.
Yes.
And the difference between counseling and therapy doesn't exist.
Right.
It varies depending on who you're talking to, what context, how a person's feeling in any given day. It's very confusing. There is no clear distinction between the two. You are an incredible therapist who is technically a counselor. We do very similar work.
Right. The difference, I think, is that I'm sort of a general counselor. Mm-hmm. So I can perform couples counseling, I can perform individual counseling, group counseling. So can everyone else, but you're a marriage and family, you have a specialization. Mm-hmm. It does get tricky, and people often ask me between psychologists and psychiatrists and stuff, but yes, you can counsel someone, like a friend might counsel a friend, but to be a counselor legit requires paperwork. I'm getting very defensive.
As you should. I have so many feelings. This is the censored version of the original script here. Biblical counselors is not a clinically recognized field. You cannot be licensed as a biblical counselor. It's like pastoral counseling. It's just an advertising label. Editing Jake here. I had to cut out some of this explanation because I didn't love how it was worded in the final cut. I wanted to talk about the lack of clarity between therapist, counselor, and licensure because it gets at one of my fundamental issues with biblical counselors, and that's that people seeking therapy are referred to them with some regularity. Because it's confusing and people just see counselor, they assume they're going to get the help that they need. When I was first entering therapy, I was still an evangelical. It was really important to me that my therapist was a Christian. I went to about 5 different pastoral counselors for help, and those sessions were useless at best and actively harmful at worst. It was in these sessions that I was told that self-harming was because of demon possession. One guy went on a rant about what happened to people in the Old Testament when they died and they didn't go to hell, but it was purgatory. Whatever, it didn't matter. It wasn't what I was there to talk about. And importantly, none of them referred me to a licensed therapist. None of them said, actually, the help that you need is not something that I'm trained in. I did eventually get matched with a licensed therapist who was a Christian, and he was really great, and the work that we did together changed my life. But I didn't know the difference between these people and their professions. No one explained it to me. I was just looking for help and knew to look for counselors and therapists. And I know I am not the only person that this has happened to, by far. Knowing what I know now, as a professional mental health care provider, I am horrified by this process. The people I saw weren't trained to work with basic depression and anxiety-related problems, let alone helping a vulnerable queer teenager grapple with their identity. And any harm inflicted on me by them is almost entirely unenforceable and unaccountable. They are all able to continue spewing their bullshit with no repercussions. This is my issue with biblical counselors. It's confusing. They aren't providing the kind of informed care that people assume they'll get when they see the title counselor. And there's no meaningful accountability or oversight to make sure that they are not doing harm to vulnerable people who are seeking help. Okay, back to the show. There are training programs for biblical counseling where you have to go do some classwork and get some supervision, but there is no oversight. There is no accreditation. There's no licensure, meaning that there is no accountability here.
Right. Which I guess I probably also should have mentioned is that we have supervision, and we have, we're not just free agents. We have people accounting for us.
If I were to put my professional backing behind the ideas in this book, I could lose my license, and I should lose my license. We're going to get into some of the specifics, but this book advocates for things that are clearly in direct violation of basic ethics and actively promote harm to people seeking help. This book violates at least 7 of the ethical standards of my specific license, and I looked into the National Board of Certified Counselors Code of Ethics, your Code of Ethics, for actually licensed counselors, because I'm not against counselors, it's the license. Highlights to me include certified counselors and candidates demonstrate their commitment to ethical behaviors by demonstrating and representing to their clients sensitivity to multicultural issues, avoiding discrimination, oppression, and or any form of social injustice. That's in the first page, and this book actively goes against that.
Yeah, also there are sort of tenets in counseling like benevolence, non-malevolence, and the idea basically, which is probably in yours too, of just generally, same as doctors, do no harm.
Do no harm, yes. Another one that really stood out to me, counselors shall perform only those professional services for which they're qualified by training, education, and supervised experience. Now, biblical counselors might come to me and say, I got training. Your training's shit.
Yeah.
Your training's shit. There's no accreditation, there's no standard things, and as we will see, they very actively reject the science of some of these issues. So you're not actually trained in these things in any meaningful, helpful way. Counselors shall take proactive measures to avoid harming their clients and avoid imposing personal values on those who receive their professional services. Counselors will seek to minimize unavoidable or unanticipated harm and, where possible, seek to address unintentional harm. Again, this book advocates for that harm. It's called What Does the Bible Teach About Transgenderism? If someone calls it transgenderism, they're not on the level. I have a lot more. It doesn't really matter.
And here's an interesting thing. Sometimes we do have a personal value, right? And that is the way we sort of view the world. And it's hard for us to... We're not blank slates, right?
Correct.
When I know that about myself, I can speak to it immediately with my clients, right? And so, for instance, I see a lot of people of size, and I come from a fat liberation standpoint, right? And I let them know immediately, right, when they come to me, or even before they come to me, that will be the viewpoint I'm using. I have literature and training in it, but that will be the viewpoint. So if that is not the viewpoint that they are wanting counseling from, they should see someone else, right? Mm-hmm. So there's a lot about like transparency and disclosure as well.
Mm-hmm. When I say like they're trained in the science, a thing that evangelicals will say is like science is just another religion. And it is not that. Again, I'm not necessarily disparaging religion, but they are not the same thing. Science is a process where you observe and have repeated observations of things. And so when we say transforming healthcare is backed by science, we mean we have looked at millions of people who received transforming healthcare. And of those people, like literally 99% of them have incredibly significant improved health outcomes. Their mood is better. The overall general health is better after receiving the appropriate level of medical care for their transition. It isn't hypothetical. It isn't, based on like my own feelings about things. They get this care and they see improvements in their lives consistently. That's what it's backed up by science means.
Yeah, proof.
Yeah. Yes. Actual proof. Whereas religion is about faith. It's about the not knowing. And that is the beautiful part of it. We're going to talk about that as well a lot. Importantly, you can be a biblical counselor and also hold a valid mental health license. Yeah. I decided not to put this person on blast, but in my research, I found a person in Chicago who's a biblical counselor and also a licensed marriage and family therapist. You can do both. I know nothing about their work. God bless, go off. How one squares that circle is beyond me, and also not something I'm particularly interested in. But it is the license that allows them to actually practice a form of medicine, and therapy is a form of medicine. That also means that they're accountable for doing harm. In some ways, me focusing so much on the licensure is a level of gatekeeping that upholds white supremacy.
Yes.
As if Western models of therapy that have a fancy license are the only way to help people. We know that is not true, and there have been healers throughout cultures before we've had licenses or Freud. But biblical counselors aren't that. That's not what we're talking about here.
Oh, this is going to be such a hot episode. I'm riled up. It's tricky. It's complicated. We're both probably going to get in big trouble.
Yeah.
I'm excited.
I did talk in supervision today about, like, what can I say that is, like, professionally correct? But the reason I'm bringing all of this up is because T. Dale Johnson, a guy whose name is, like, in the first pages of this book, who says how much he loves this writing, is the executive director for the Association of Certified Biblical Counselors. So keep in mind...
The Association of who?
Certified Biblical Counselors.
Certified?
Biblical Counselors.
Certified by who?
By them, by themselves.
That's the thing, right?
Yeah.
What certification?
They have a training program that it's self-paced, but you could do in 2 years. It costs... This is the part that killed me. It cost $1,400. I am $60,000 in student debt.
Oh my God.
For my license, but sure, $1,400 for...
Sure. Yeah, you can get certifications in almost anything.
That's the other thing. You can be certified in whatever.
Right. Oh, off topic, but really quick, but we'll talk about it later. Did you know that I'm going to, after I get my LCPC, I'm going to become certified in thanatology?
Thanatology?
Yeah.
That's cool. I love Thanos.
The study of death.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then I'll be certified, so that makes me a professional.
So keep that in mind. All of the bullshit we were talking about is co-signed by the executive director of Association of Certified Biblical Counselors.
And I do want to hammer on this to say, like, that is a fancy title to make people feel like that's very official and professional. And we've just broken it down. Like, it's just a self-appointed thing. Like, I can call you the certified, like, whiskey filler, right? Like, but it is nothing. It's mumbo-jumbo language again.
This is especially problematic because this book hates therapy, and they very clearly distinguish between counseling and therapy. And here's our first quote. We should expect this kind of shift in a culture that swapped out divine holiness for therapeutic wellness. We who love Scripture cannot affirm such an exchange. Doing so threatens to compromise the entire theological structure of Christian morality. Ours is not a psychological faith at its base. Ours is a theological faith. One with profound moral duties before God. So anything that they say is therapy sucks shit.
I hate it here.
Uh-huh.
This is awful. This is going to be my most hated episode.
Here's another good one. Strangely, Christians sometimes focus a great deal on what psychologists and doctors say about gender dysphoria and related issues. Strangely. Because we have the science, because we have the actual people's lived experiences.
Also, get the fuck over it.
Uh-huh.
Like, why are we... They're so obsessed with this.
This is, I think, a really good... like I said, this is a horrifyingly helpful case study on why these things are so stuck on this. Oh my God. They hate therapy because therapy as a practice is founded on respecting client autonomy and not forcing them into a belief system. It's about helping clients to be a better version of themselves, even when you disagree with what that means. And that is not what these clowns want.
No, because you know what? As I mentioned earlier when I was talking about these kind of major tenets of counseling and therapy, one is autonomy.
Yes, that's a big part of it.
Yeah. And they do not want any autonomy. Like, you do not fit under the Christian or evangelical umbrella when you are seeking autonomy.
Yes, they are using biblical counseling as another means of control.
Yes.
Section 1, a treatise on patriarchy. Although this book is about transgenderism, it is actually and explicitly about patriarchy. There are 3 chapters in this book, and 2 of them are about biblical gender roles. This is such a clear example that transphobia is rooted in misogyny. Like, in this whole book theoretically about trans people, they just spend the entire time talking about how women are less than men. They don't say it in those words, but that's the entire thrust of this book. They try so hard to say that they are reading the Bible literally. Bible literalism. We've been here before with Dobson and his contemporaries. They take a hyper-literal approach to interpreting the Bible, then claim they know it's true because they know the mind and will of God. Everything that upholds their power is because God says so, and everything that threatens their power is sinful and not actually in the Bible, not worth exploring. Quote, "The Bible is the very mind and will of God. The Bible is God-breathed such that every word is inspired by the Holy Spirit. Accordingly, the Bible is inerrant, without error in all that it teaches. Thus, the Bible is authoritative, the standard of all standards. So the Bible is fully sufficient, perfectly fitted to purify us and conform us to God's holy standard. The Bible is not one religious book among many, therefore. The Bible is the very word of God, the truth we need to form a worldview, to understand our lives, and to live for God's glory."
The very word of God, but, retranslated over and over for every different
Yes.
generation of people.
I have a note later about this too. What version of the Bible are we talking about?
Right.
The word choice matters a great deal. If we're translating arsenicoides, the word that modern translations refer to as homosexuality, in prior translations referred to pederasty, men who would prey on young boys. That one word choice means a great deal of difference. But those translations matter, let alone the Catholic Bible has extra books in it. The Book of Mormon is based on the Bible, but also some other stuff. Islam has the Old Testament, the New Testament, and then more. Like what version are we talking about? What translation? At what point? Also, the King James version of the Bible, in which most English translations are based off of, was explicitly a political project.
Right.
Do we go back further?
Oh, Jake. Get this book away from me. I'm feeling its vibes shooting towards
You can throw
me.
it. Nice.
Good catch.
Good for us.
Yeah.
Football. I'm spending so much time talking about their like hyper literal interpretation of the Bible because their arguments rely incredibly heavily on a super literal interpretation of the Adam and Eve story, and as interpreted by young Earth creationists. We haven't really talked about young Earth creationists all that much in this series. What do you know about young Earth creationists?
Absolutely nothing. Not even one thing. I've never even heard of it.
I'm sure you're familiar with the concept, but I am so sorry to break it to you here. Young Earth creationists is a new theological idea that purports that the Earth is about 6,000 years old. They get to this number by adding up all the days and years in the Bible. In this view, then, the Earth was made in a literal 6 days, 6 24-hour days. No room for allegory.
Right.
Noah's flood was a literal event where it rained for literally 40 days and literally 40 nights. As a side note, 40 days and 40 nights is a somewhat common phrase in biblical text. It was a colloquialism at the time. It means a really long time.
Yeah, like Adam and Eve weren't like, hey, let's hang out at 6:30. Like, time wasn't invented in that way.
No. 40 Days and 40 Nights is like me saying I've been reading Dobson's works for 1,000 years. It just feels that way, but it doesn't mean it's necessarily true.
Yeah.
Also, importantly, ancient theologians like St. Augustine, or even assholes like John Calvin, who I don't know if you know those names, but they're like really important in biblical translation history.
Okay.
They recognized that the timeline of creation was at least somewhat allegorical. Owen Strachan and Gavin Peacock's arguments depend on the literal to the point of absurdist interpretations, because they claim to base their views on gender on the most minuscule details in the Adam and Eve story. Quote, while we do glimpse poetic structuring in Genesis 1 and 2, we come face to face with the actual making of all things. So let's talk about Adam and Eve.
Great.
Quote, he made the man and the woman, male and female he created them, reads Genesis. We cannot source our sex in evolution or evolutionary theory, we see here. Our manhood and womanhood does not trace back to the chaos, randomness, luck, chance, or happenstance. Not evolution. And they love to call evolution a theory. One of the best ways to set Kevin off is just randomly be like, yeah, but evolution's a theory. I don't know if that's true anymore. It was for a period of time.
Oh, Kevin. I can't wait to meet Kevin.
Kevin and Kelly come to Chicago.
Kevin and Kelly, get to Chicago. We'll take you somewhere fun. I think they would really want to meet me.
I think so. Absolutely. We talk about you a good deal. Quote, the woman has a distinct role. God looks at the first human creation, the man, and effectively says, he needs help. He must need help, for he cannot multiply by himself. Under Adam's leadership, signaled by his naming of Eve, she will assist him in filling and subduing the earth. These are all them quoting the Bible, but also it's them misquoting the Bible. They say him naming Eve signals her submission in Genesis 2, verse 23. That's not the verse where Eve is named.
Oh, interesting.
This is where she's called woman, meaning coming from man, but also Eve doesn't mean helper. It means to give life to, the mother of humanity. So they're just wrong on both counts. She will exhibit numerous strengths and abilities, such as texts like Proverbs 31, but her vocation as a wife and a mother factor hugely at this point in the biblical narrative. So the Adam and Eve story, God creates the world, creates Adam to rule over the world, says, you're lonely, let me take a rib from you, create a woman. And they read so much into every little single detail. The fact that woman came from man in this interpretation means that she is naturally submissive because he was there first place. That's the one that God wanted, and she's just a helper. That's her biblical defined role, which is a way to interpret that story.
Uh-huh.
It is not the only way
Right.
to interpret that story. The fact that, she is a wife and a mother in the story of creation, sure, that can be roles that women play, but they're saying those are your primary roles that you play because those were, in their interpretation of the story, the primary. Like, they take every single little sentence and make it hyper literal.
Right.
So now let's talk about the fall. The fall is when Eve ate the apple because of the snake.
Right.
And the snake wasn't actually Satan, but Christians like to mean that it is Satan. Also, if you're reading this in a hyper literal sense, that means that at one point snakes had legs.
Will you draw me a picture of a snake with legs?
It'll look like Trogdor, but yeah.
Who is Trondor?
Don't worry about it. Quote, in the very real historical fall of Genesis and the fall that follows, we learn why we all naturally stray from God's good plan for the sexes. Again, the Adam and Eve story was historically not read to be this literal.
Right.
It was meant to be largely allegorical. Different theologians throughout time and different religions will put different emphasis on different parts of it for sure. But like reading it as this hyper literal is a really recent invention in theology.
Yeah, you know what else is not supposed to be hyper literal, but is supposed to be mostly allegorical?
Mm-hmm.
The whole entire Bible.
Yeah. Despite what evangelicals say, the Bible is not primarily a historical document.
Right.
Most religious texts are not a historical document. That's not denigrating them. That's just not what their purpose is.
Right.
An issue that I have with young earth creationism, Why would God put fossils in the ground to lie to us? Why would he make the laws of physics and chemistry, which make things like radiocarbon dating possible, so consistent if they're also fundamentally wrong? Okay, going back to like how they're constructing this argument out of this like hyper-literalism. Quote, the man fails to protect his wife. He should have rebuked the serpent and enacted violence against the snake, but only stands to the side, passively eating the forbidden fruit as his wife directs him. Because of the fall, people will now use their bodies and their very lives to dishonor God. They go a whole thing about how they weren't ashamed of being naked until the fall, and then they cover it up, and that's dishonoring God. They will do this by rejecting God's wiring of their bodies, their male and female identities, and their relationships. Made according to God's wisdom, they will turn away from it and fashion their own self-conception. That is a lot of inference from what they're purporting to be a very literal interpretation. Them covering themselves up for their nakedness, you do not have to interpret as them using their bodies to dishonor God. They also say, quote, people decry created order and seek to make their neo-pagan order. They have a whole thing about paganism in here. And evidence of this neo-pagan order, we call fathers and mothers, the more generic term parents. And we see fathers and mothers as essentially the same. Young men wear the clothes and adopt the hairstyles of young women. Young women wear the clothes and adopt the hairstyles of young men. That is them dishonoring their bodies and engaging in neo-pagan lifestyles.
Jake, I'm going to dissociate.
Yep, probably.
Oh, God. You know, you only get one life, and you have to, like, you can spend it doing all this, like, believing all this stuff, really, like, I'm having an emotional breakdown.
This isn't even the hardest stuff.
Great.
It gets sillier in a bad way in a little bit, and that'll be a good little reprieve. They twist Jesus to fit their agenda, specifically Matthew 19. This is a surprisingly common talking point among evangelical spaces when trying to shit-talk trans people, because the Bible doesn't actually talk about trans people at all. A quick rundown of Matthew 19. The religious leaders at the time were called the Pharisees, and they hated Jesus. And if you know the memes, it's because he told the truth. If you don't worry about it. They're always trying to trick him or tempt him or get him to slip up and prove that he wasn't actually the Son of God. This is an explainer from BibRef. Some Pharisees find Jesus as well and come to test him with a difficult and divisive question. They hope to get Jesus to say something to discredit him in the eyes of the people, or he might give them cause to accuse him of heresy. They ask Jesus if it is unlawful for a man to divorce a wife for any cause. Some Pharisees said it was infidelity was the only allowable cause. Others said a man could divorce his wife for virtually any reason. Jesus quotes from Genesis, citing God's plan for marriage. God made human beings to be male and female and decreed that men should leave their parents and hold fast to their wives to become one flesh in marriage. Men should not separate what God has joined, Jesus concludes. This is the part that's most often talked about. There's more to the story, but they really hone in on Jesus quoting Genesis and saying God made marriage for this, and what God created, let no man separate. They hone in on that as Jesus affirming their entire hyper-literalist worldview. They claim that Jesus quoting Genesis as him saying this was a real historical thing, which he nowhere says.
Right.
The rest of the story, though, the Pharisees push back by referring to Deuteronomy 24, where Moses permits a man to give his wife a certificate of divorce for indecency. Jesus insists that Moses allowed this because human hearts are hard. It was never God's intent for marriage, and for that reason, anyone who divorces his wife, except for sexual immorality, commits adultery as soon as he marries another woman. Now, this is a story about marriage, the role of marriage, the intricacies of marriage, and how largely when the Pharisees come up in stories of Jesus, they're meant to show that religious leaders at the time are so focused on the specific letter of the law, they miss the spirit of the law, essentially. And so Jesus is doing that here. You're trying to find, trip me up by saying this contradicts this. All of this is God's plan for marriage is this. You're missing the point here. That's what this story is about. But evangelicals love to focus in on just that first part where Jesus quotes Genesis and saying, see, he said God made the male and female and therefore not trans. Which is just not a good interpretation.
No. You know who did allow a divorce? You'll be surprised to learn. Pioneer people.
Interesting.
American pioneers.
Interesting.
Totally cool with divorce because there weren't enough women.
For similar reasons, the hanky code has origins in pioneer space. The hanky code, for those uninitiated, are hankies traditionally worn by gay men in their back pockets of different colors to signify what sexual acts they're into. They started, at least in part, in pioneer times because there were not a lot of women in pioneer towns.
Yeah.
So they would still have dances because people love to dance. And so hanky in one pocket would signal that you were fine being the man, and the other that you were fine being the woman and letting the other person lead.
So interesting.
Yeah, America has not been this Christian nationalist nation
Nope.
for as long as evangelicals would have you believe. But here's a quote from them. This is how they interpret that Matthew 19 passage that we spent far too long talking about. The Son of God here tells us that the materials of Genesis 1 and 2 is a historical fact. The early chapters of the Bible map out God's intention for the sexes. Except, no. Jesus talking about the creation myth isn't him saying it's a historical fact. It means there's truth in it, and he's trying to explain that truth. And further, this story isn't really only about the fact that there's two genders. It's about divorce and marriage. But God made marriage to act out his ideals of gender, which is a quote from this book. That's an interpretation. But that's at least one step away from Jesus is saying here. That's an inference and an interpretation. That's not actually what's being said. If you care so much about being hyper-literalist, it's like the same things that Supreme Court justices are doing by saying they're like originalists, they're textualists. No, you're not. You're not that. You all still have your interpretation, but you're obscuring the fact that you're interpreting it to make yourself seem more valid. How do we figure out what's literal and what's allegorical? Any given theologian might have an answer to these questions, but they're all inherently unanswerable. These are ongoing questions. Faith is hard. The universe feels chaotic and contradictory. Whatever your beliefs are, there are definitely going to be some inconsistencies. That doesn't mean that you are bad or wrong. It means you can't figure it all out, and that's okay. People have disagreed on the points since religion began, which is why there are so many fucking different religions. Right. It takes some fucking balls to say, yes, but I have the one truth, and these other Christians and theologians are so wrong, and I can prove it just by reading the Bible. Putting seemingly contradicting ideas in conversation with each other is usually when we get a deeper form of understanding. In therapy, we call this dialectics, like dialectic behavioral therapy, putting two truths in conversation with each other. Or, less fancy of a term, both and thinking. Both of these things are true, and also a little bit more. For what it's worth, and how I read these verses, I hear Jesus doing the same. The two ideas he talks are seemingly in contradiction with each other. You can't divorce, but also you can in these circumstances. In order to reveal some deeper truth, the Pharisees are too legalistic while ignoring God's true intentions and heart. So, a roundup so far. This book is arguing Adam and Eve were literal people who did the literal actions as described by the English Bible. Men have to lead women because women cannot be trusted to make sound decisions. Men work, women have their babies. And we see this in Genesis and with Jesus, who is definitely affirming the literal interpretation of these texts, which wasn't even a thing at that time. Now let's talk about men and women. The roles of biblical manhood.
Biblical manhood, now open on Sundays.
Wow, that'd be good. That'd be like a brunch, a drag brunch on Sundays called Biblical Manhood.
Oh God, nobody steal this.
This is copywritten.
Yeah, we're gonna be millionaires.
So how do they define manhood and womanhood? Very helpfully, quote, the first creation observation is that manliness and womanliness flows from being made man or woman. To put it another way, how a man or woman thinks and acts precedes who they are, consulted by God as male or female, or vice versa. We read that God made them male and female, and immediately he says, be fruitful and multiply. The complementary male and female functions in sexual unions flow directly from the created sex.
Okay.
So it's a bunch of nonsense, like circular reasoning. A man does man stuff, a woman does woman stuff.
It doesn't really mean anything.
But that last little bit, they focus a lot on be fruitful and multiply.
Yeah.
That's a really big thing in this book. The point of you, according to them, the point of being a man or being a woman is to fuck or be fucked. They base their entire worldview on sex. They care so much about sex. They are so fucking horny.
Yes.
They view the entire encapsulation of what it means to be a man is to reproduce and have children, and for a woman to carry a man's children, because it's also like ownership possession thing.
Oh, yeah.
Just because your sexuality is in deep repression doesn't mean that it's not controlling you. If you see all relationships as a means to facilitate having kids, you're a fucking weirdo. They define biblical manhood with 3 tenets: courage, being a husband and father, and aspiring to eldership. The only important thing with courage is this weird quote, effeminacy in a man is wrong in every form.
What?
Being effeminate.
Yeah, being a woman.
In every term. Now, they also preemptively get at me. To be sure, the Apostle Paul says in other places that he is like a nursing mother, which he does. But he was not a mother. He was a father. He was masculine and not feminine. And I did read this like a 6-year-old when you tell him that his G.I. Joe is a doll.
Yeah.
I'm like, no, he's Hashkin figure. It's masculine.
That was not your writing. That was from the book.
That's from the book.
Do it again.
The Apostle Paul, in other places, says he was like a nursing mother, but he was not a mother. He was a father. And he was masculine and not feminine.
Why is that so good? I could never forget that.
I did laugh out loud when I read that. They mean it.
Why? They don't say why.
No, just because it doesn't fit into this thing. Again, they're doing so much interpretation, but they are not admitting to it at all. Because to admit to it would be open to the possibility that there might be other valid interpretations.
Why did the Apostle Paul say he was like a nursing mother?
Because he was tending to and caring for churches. Most of the New Testament, it was claimed to be written by the Apostle Paul, although a lot of them are just written by random people.
And they believe in the Apostle Paul.
Mm-hmm.
And he was a man.
Yes.
And he was tending to and caring.
Mm-hmm.
In his own words, like a woman.
Yeah, like a mother.
Right? And that's fine.
But he was a masculine. he's being a mother in a masculine way. Despite them literally defining womanhood as being a mother.
This is so banana town.
Yeah.
I don't even know how people can like circle around this stuff in this way. Like, you have to really want to believe this to fight these fights.
Yes.
Okay.
I want to spend a little bit of time on this. Being a husband and father is one of the 3 things that they like define being a man as. Quote, manhood means being a father. All marriages should desire children as fruit. Also, calling them fruit is weird.
Oh, is that why it's fruit of the loom? No.
Oh, no.
No.
Ugh. That makes you feel weird. Moving on. Okay. Quote, manhood is there's a lot. They use this a lot. Manhood is tied to a picture of redemption because marriage is a picture of Christ and the church, according to the Bible. So just as the roles of Christ and the church cannot be reversed, so it is with a husband and wife. The husband, and this is their emphasis, the husband is the head. This is his position with the team, and he must play the role.
Oh my God, we get it.
Headship means leading with authority.
Do you know what it is? As we talk about like creationism in the beginning, is that like women can create life, right? Mm-hmm. Of course they need the seed from they need a sperm.
At this point, yeah.
But like they create life, and I think I've even said this before on this podcast. That is like so threatening somehow to men and manhood that they had to create this entire system that like weirdly like takes the power out of that and makes it into like, oh yeah, you're just like the nurturing little lady, like with the babies. But it's like, do you know what it's like to like, I mean, I don't, I never did it. Mm-hmm. But like to know that I have the ability or like had like to do that, like that is crazy powerful, right? The truth is that we all women secretly know that we actually are.
There's
number one.
I think it was when bringing up boys, I did a deep dive into this. It didn't make it into the podcast, but paternal jealousy feels around like being the quote unquote real father of a child is something that is to some degree cross-cultural. And it does seem to be like this weird bugaboo that men have around like this is like my child.
Yeah. And
the fact that theoretically you do not know that because you did not come out of your body. Your wife could have slept around or whatever. Right. It like gets into men's heads in a really weird way that maybe it's because I don't want kids, but like I don't I don't understand.
I think the act of like creating life and giving birth is so powerful that men have to like take that power away from women somehow, whether it's violence or shame or this fucked up system of like men are the bosses, right? But it's just like it's so inherently the other way around.
Yeah.
In my view.
Yeah.
Right? That it's like, oh yeah, we can't let women have that much power.
There are some really interesting feminist anarchist scholars that I read who purport, and I buy into this, that the first form of oppression was patriarchy and misogyny. That's the first like systemic level of oppression that like men had to suppress. Very much the same thing that you're talking about. This like women have a lot of power, and like no, we can't have that, so we must suppress them.
Yeah, I like that. Well, you cut this, but I like that Instagram post you sent me the other day, or TikTok or whatever, that was like, bisexual men just want men. Bisexual women just want men. Everybody wants men. I'm like, nope. It's interesting though to me that the thing that comes up for people, these people write about male gayness, right? I'm sloppy with my words right now. Is the like association of it to womanhood, as opposed to like the attraction to men, which by their standards should make sense, right? Like, men are so powerful and so amazing. Who wouldn't be attracted to a man, including men, right?
To some degree, there's nothing more masculine than gay sex.
That's exactly right. So they have to focus on the idea that it somehow makes you a woman to be a gay man, right? And that makes you like weak and less and all this stuff. It's just so weird.
There's a weird like revealing of objectification that goes on through that, where like they view the act of being penetrated as like inherently degrading in some way.
Yeah.
Because they project their own feelings around like othering and objectification onto often women. And so if a man is a bottom, that's feminine and that's bad.
Right.
This is still a thing in like gay spaces. Bottom shaming is still very much a thing that's prevalent, which as a self-professed top, I have nothing but respect for bottoms. It is a skill that I do not possess, and God bless our troops.
But it is this idea that like men are like pushing forward, pushing out, like giving out, right? And women are taking in, like absorbing, right? Like all of that. It's a weird. It's just. I want to go home so bad.
This will make you want to stay, I'm sure. Quote, "The aim in leading your wife is her holiness, not coddling her or pandering her sinful inclinations. In our passage, Paul instructs a husband to wash his wife with the word. This means he will take lead in devotions. He will give overall directions for families and decision-making. He regularly takes the lead in bringing the word to his wife in daily devotions and the words of biblical instructions, and if need be, correction."
Yeah.
Yikes. Yeah. But women cannot discipline men. Women cannot correct men. That is not their job. That is not their role. It is one-sided. And they also aspiring to...
And I'm sorry, I'm just real chatty about this right now.
Yeah.
But that really is still prevalent.
Yes.
Right?
The other third tenet that they have is aspiring to eldership. And elders in the church is like a biblical role. From the Bible, this is from 1 Timothy 2:12-14. You might be familiar with this verse. "I do not permit a woman to teach or exercise authority over man. Rather, she is to remain quiet. For Adam was formed first and then Eve. And Adam was not deceived, but the woman was deceived and became the transgressor." That is a Bible quote. That is not from this book. That's from the Bible. I am not here to argue theology, and I would imagine that many Christians don't know what to do with this verse. I will say, though, that Paul, the guy who's supposed author of this book of the Bible at least, was writing to a guy named Timothy in a place called Ephesus about problems in that local church at that time. Understanding what parts of that letter only apply to the church at the time versus apply universally and throughout time, again, is a question without an answer. But these chuckle fucks are going to harp on this a fucking bunch.
Did you call them struggle fucks?
Chuckle fucks.
Oh.
I'm struggling. That's for me.
Struggle fucks.
So how do they define biblical womanhood? I heard you not asking.
Oh, God. It's like, do you actually hate me?
No, I just hate myself. You're just a victim to this.
Biblical womanhood is the club down the street.
Being a helper, being a wife and mother, being a Titus 2 woman, which we're not going to get into, doesn't matter.
Being a what woman?
Titus 2. Titus is a book of the Bible.
Okay.
This is, I'm sure you will love this one. Having a gentle and quiet spirit. Brooke is not thrilled. I'm going to look away because I feel hurt just by that look.
Yeah, readers, I have an angry streak that Jake's only ever seen once. You know what's interesting? I've talked about my dad before on this podcast and how he was religious, Episcopalian, not evangelical, although he was. We'll get into that later at the end. Anyway, he wrote me a letter from his deathbed, I believe, that said, "Always be gentle and kind." And I remember being like, "Huh? How? No." Right? But that is, again, that's so prevalent. Gentleness of spirit.
Yeah. So being a life-giving helper is the label that they gave. Quote, "The woman was taken from the man for the man. That is, she was made from Adam and brought to him as a helper fit for him. In supporting his leadership, she would help him spread God's dominion by having children and multiplying imagers of God across the earth. Her helping role comes directly from her created sex. Whether married or not, she should seek to support men wherever she can."
Oh, God. Remember when we did Veggie Tales?
The performance of biblical womanhood entails finding joy in helping men rather than battling them or knocking them down a peg. Being a wife and mother, it is vital to emphasize that a wife's submission to her husband is crucial to the picture of the gospel they display. It is a central feature of biblical womanhood for that reason. Different quote that really got me. As an anti-authority, abuse-aware age, our culture might construe submission as weak and dangerous. Nonetheless, Paul called wives to submit to their own husbands. This would never include submission to abuse or mistreatment as sin. These things needfully noted, the wife is called to submit to her husband in all aspects of their lives together. So mentions of abuse in relationships get not even a line and a half of discussion in this book. It's all about like how a wife should submit. The fact that there's been a pretext for incredibly abusive relationships, a line and a half, not even, of mention.
The takeaway is women are for men.
Yes. And they say that explicitly.
Yeah.
From men for men.
That's so dangerous and gross.
Strikingly, it is her conduct, not her conversation, that will win him. He's heard the word already, but it is her respect and purity that serves as an evangelicalism adornment to the gospel. So, you don't need to nag.
Jake, when will this be over?
We're on page 10.
Ugh. Okay.
I found this interesting, related to something we were talking about just a second ago. Being a wife flows into motherhood. Her body submits and receives her husband in the love of the one flesh union and the fruit of life. They talk about sex in such a weird fucking way.
Her body flows?
Mm-hmm.
That and receives her husband?
Yeah.
That's like straight out of the fairy porn I read.
It does feel like bad smut. Again, they're so horny.
It is like weirdly like erotic.
Yes. I mentioned this before, but there's a book that I read called Every Young Man's Battle. It's about like why you need to be sexually pure as a teenage boy, and it is just softcore porn.
How many times did you read it?
Did I read the book or certain sections of the book? I think it's a different question. I think I only read the book fully like twice. Having a gentle and quiet spirit. Quote, Eve forgot her God-given position, but true femininity is humbly content with hers. That's beautiful. Notice, this is a book about transgenderism. We are an hour into recording, and we haven't talked about trans people. Fuck off.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that.
Gender's perhaps the cornerstone
No,
of the...
because... I'm sorry.
Go for it.
Because what they're really trying to set up more is that being a woman is a terrible thing to be.
Yes.
So I'm sure I can predict that this book that you have is going to be about being a trans woman.
Largely, yes.
Right. Okay. And then they'll throw in everything else. But that's really the crime, right?
Yep.
Because being a woman is a crime.
Yep.
Why would you want to be?
Yep.
And if you can't multiply, right, in that way, if you can't give birth and do the woman things. I'm gonna pull all of my hair out. Will you take a picture of me really quick?
You are actively pulling out your hair.
But I have to get sad.
I want to take a moment to talk about power dynamics, because as much as I generally believe there should be equity and equality in relationships, I work with couples that have a stated power dynamic. That's actually a specialty of mine. In a dom-sub relationship, handler-pup, even master-slave, as loaded as those words can be, I am by no means opposed to relationships with a power dynamic, and it can be done safely and in a healthy manner. If it works for you, it works. And if you want to be in a dom-sub relationship based on religious roleplay with a breeding kink, go nuts. Which is what this is.
Yeah, but those all have one thing in common. Consent.
Mm-hmm.
Right? I'm not even against any of this if it's what everybody wants, right? If what's her face, Candace Cameron, right? Like, she gets out there and she's like, this is what I want in my marriage. Go for it then.
Love that.
Great.
Yes.
But like the idea that this is the way it should be and that you all have to do it,
that
and
part.
that you're wrong if you don't, right?
That is literally my next note.
Okay.
Yes. There's also a fine line between dom-sub relationships, power dynamic relationships, and abuse. And it's something that I teach therapists about. It can be hard to parse out sometimes. Things like financial control, bodily autonomy, the ability to say no, respect, and so on, which this all takes away from people. Not every trad-wife relationship is abusive, but we know that so many are. And if these psychopaths had their way, it wouldn't be optional. They are actively trying to get rid of no-fault divorce, for Christ's sakes. That is a huge bugaboo of theirs.
Can you tell me, because you're a youth, what a trad wife really is?
Uh,
I've heard it, but what is it?
It's a trend by mostly grifters online to be like, I'm a traditional wife. Look at all this bread I made for my husband. I don't have to have a job.
Oh, okay.
Which, not having a job and making bread does sound delightful, but that's not actually what traditional...
Are they the ones who are like, my husband wanted wheat bread, so I picked some wheat? And...
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. But also, they have a job. That is their job. They're influencers, and typically they make more money than their husbands.
Yeah, they're making money.
Yeah. We're almost to the part on transgenderism. That part will actually go quickly, I swear. But they really hate androgyny, quote-unquote androgyny. They spend a lot of time talking. It's not just trans stuff. Quote, in both the Old and New Testaments, men and women receive a divine summons to steer clear of androgynous, gender-bending decisions and actions. The Bible makes the point quite plain. Men glorify God by presenting themselves as men. Women glorify God by presenting themselves as women. We cannot miss that scriptures expressly forbid what some call gender bending. Right smack in the middle of a list of abominable, very ungodly behavior, the Old Testament law speaks clearly. God prohibited, in the clearest possible terms, the presentation as an opposite sex identity. Thousands of years ago, well before modern gender advocacy, the Bible shuts down the possibility of gender bending. There is a whole section called Hair and Holiness about why it is sinful for men to have long hair and why it is sinful for women to have short hair.
But let's talk about what people look like in the Bible times.
That's the other thing that, yes! What are men's clothes? What are women's clothes?
Right. Everybody had long hair and wore a dress in the Bible times.
Well, men wore a robe.
They were wearing a dress.
Culture is constantly shifting and evolving. The cultural signifiers of manhood and womanhood are constantly shifting and evolving. For women to wear pants would be seen as controversial years ago, and in some Christian spaces it still is. They explicitly say it's okay for girls to wear jeans sometimes. Some people, some cultures sometimes would argue that that is them gender bending, right? These things are nuanced and there's not one strict way to interpret it, but that's how they're doing it because they're not actually arguing about these things or trying to make an argument for power.
Guess who wore pants recently?
Most people?
No, guess who? Someone.
Oh, is it a Duggar?
Yeah, Michelle.
Ooh.
There's a photo.
Wow. There's a photo.
Yeah.
Jeez.
Which goes to show you, like, when you realize it's more convenient, when you realize it, then you can bend it, yes. Right? Which is what she did.
Here's an important quote, I think. We're going to skip through the rest of this because there's a lot of silly quotes, but we do not have freedoms as non-Christians think they do to dress, present, and act however we see fit. Oh, wow, look at her wearing pants.
I'm sorry, I didn't want to listen to Jake anymore, so I just Googled Michelle Duggar pants.
The first thing I clocked was the font behind them, because all church stuff was written in that same cursive font.
That's Tradwife font.
That is Tradwife font, absolutely.
Yeah. All right, I know what that is then.
The trans stuff.
Yeah.
Part 1, being trans is fake and sinful and a delusion.
I noticed when I paged through the book that you spent half of a cent on, that it was referred almost exclusively from what I saw as the sexual sin.
Yes. They connect trans stuff, which is a gender thing, right, to not only sex like biological sex, but sex as in the act of fucking sex.
That is so weird.
Language around trans stuff is constantly evolving, and I'm going to use some terms that viewers might find objectionable, but also it's important to tease out some of these differences.
And I would like to say trans people themselves use various language for themselves.
Yes.
And I've heard all sorts of different things. So it is very much like your community, your like.
It is mostly the cis people that have issues with the language that trans people use, right. I find. So being transgender is an umbrella term that just means your gender identity is different from the gender you were assigned at birth, for various reasons. Transsexual is a term typically used by people who have medically transitioned in some way, typically with some kind of surgical element to it. You receive bottom surgery, you might refer to yourself as a transsexual. You're literally changing your sex in a way. Transvestite is more of a sexual fetish. That is people who get a sexual kick typically out of cross-dressing. So cis men who have no plans to transition at all, who just get a hard-on when they wear a pair of panties. That's a thing that exists, but they classify all trans stuff basically as a form of transvestitism.
Interesting.
I think we see some sexual oppression in there.
Uh-huh.
I don't necessarily think that all these people are trans, God forbid, but I do think like it is okay to embrace your femininity and sexuality for whatever that means for you. And they're so threatened by that, and they're so off limits, but when your sexuality is repressed in this way, it's going to come out. We're really bad at keeping things actually repressed.
Yep. You know that Gavin Peacock's got a lace thong on.
I bet Kevin Peacock, I have so many jokes I could make. There's no such thing as a trans Christian. In the same way, we must not affirm the term gay Christian. You cannot define yourself by something that is clearly sinful and for which Jesus died. Your identity must ultimately be in Christ and not your sexuality. Christ is the center of your universe, not your sexuality. Trans isn't about sexuality. Now, it is further complicated because trans people are sexual beings. And if you are trans, it is okay if you transition to like your body in a sexual way. I will say you should not engage in surgical interventions solely for a sexual kick. But I have yet to meet a single trans person who does that.
Right.
First of all, that's a lot of paperwork. That's a lot of time.
Also, you have met and you know many trans people. How many people have, like, that you've met or know, and you can cut this because I'm just curious, really, have, like, what they always say, regretted it or wished it?
Not a single one.
Not a single one.
We're going to talk about that.
Okay,
I have some numbers as well. Yes.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
I had not really heard that I had not really heard that transgenderism was like an umbrella term. Mm-hmm. Do you identify as trans?
I do identify as trans. It's not something that I talk a whole lot about because it does feel a little bit like co-opting a struggle that isn't fully mine. Uh-huh. But I'm a very genderqueer, non-binary person on the inside. I say that my gender presentation is not masculine to feminine. It's lazy to extra. And most days I'm just lazy. It is not my fault that right now I'm wearing a sweater and jeans, that society reads this as masculine, right? That's their problem, not mine. My gender identity is very much not the one that was assigned to me at birth. But I'm also not really looking to change my biology in any significant way. Hormones, I'm fine enough with the body I have, and hormones seem like a lot of work. Again, lazy to extra. I'm very much on the lazy category a lot of times. I am not the one who's going to be most impacted by the political impacts of transphobia. I let other more impacted trans people take the stage and the space when talking about trans issues typically. Mm-hmm.
I think that's really interesting. Thank you for telling me that.
Yeah, I'm going to keep at least part of that in.
Yeah.
I don't think I've ever really talked about my gender on the pod before, on the blog.
The popcorn blog?
The popcorn blog. This is a very beautiful and nuanced conversation around gender, and I love this.
And we're going to go away to something.
And we're going to go right back to the cure for transgenderism is just thinking differently. Literally,
I just wanted it. We remember when we were having that nice conversation a second ago. Okay.
Literally, the section title is "Change the Body" or "Change the Mind." Transgender surgery is not the answer, in the sense that you are trapped in the body of the opposite sex. The transgender lifestyle is not the answer. Transformation of the mind is the answer. Inside and out renewal is needed.
I think this is why I hate CBT. I just put that together right now.
And CBT meaning cognitive behavioral therapy,
Yes.
not cock and ball torture.
Yeah.
Okay.
Cock and ball torture.
Yeah.
Do you hate CBT?
Both of them, yes.
Yeah. I just really realized that right now.
Because I use some elements of CBT sometimes because getting out of emotional reasoning and being able to be like, the story I'm telling myself isn't necessarily true, that can be a helpful set of skills. But at a certain point, CBT is just gaslighting yourself.
Yes, it is. And I used to call it reprogram the robot.
Yeah.
And my teachers did not think that was funny. But to me, it feels like, oh, do you have a problem? Don't.
Yeah. Have you tried not being depressed?
Yeah. Like the old doctor joke, like, it hurts when I do this. Don't do that.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. Okay. Well, that's an important thing for me to think about later.
Our minds just direct what we do with our bodies. Our function flows out of where our mind finds our identity. So just, you need to find your identity in God, not your sexuality, which is not how these things work. That is not how identity works. Christ is fully sufficient, and in him we lack nothing. This includes the ability to live as the sex we are wonderfully made. In that last little bit, and they emphasize this a couple different ways, you just aren't trying hard enough. If you really want to not be trans, you cannot be trans. And you just need to pray harder or trust God more.
The same way you don't have to be gay and you don't have to be all the other things that they don't like. Like,
spoiler alert, one of the other books in this trilogy is What Does the Bible Teach About Homosexuality? And I have not read it. I'm sure they make that argument.
Yeah.
They try to differentiate between, for gay stuff, struggling with same-sex attraction and being gay. Gay is the like embrace of that. But if you struggle and you try to push it away...
We've talked about that on this podcast. Yeah.
Across many studies, for many years, including one study that I found that lasted from 1972 to 2017, trans people report a marked decrease in distress and suicidal ideation and an increase in functioning, overall functioning, and more specific ones as well, after receiving gender-affirming care. We also know that a significant amount of suicidal ideation that remains is related to external harassment and victimization, such as the acute harassment advocated by this book.
Everybody feels better when they are able to be their true identity.
Yes.
Is the short version.
Going back to something you mentioned a little bit earlier, rates of regret are incredibly low, averaging about 1%. And many of the studies that I have cited in the episode description are meta-analyses, meaning that they looked at results from a bunch of individual studies. Any one given study might have a different number. That is normal. That is part of the scientific process. You're going to get some statistical noise. But when you look at the bigger picture, some of that noise gets filtered out, and that's what these meta-analyses are for. When you look at all of these studies, 1% of regret, knee replacements have a higher regret. Gastric bypass has a higher regret. LASIK has a higher regret.
Gastric bypass has a huge regret.
That sure does.
We won't even go down the road, I promise you.
We will one day.
Someday when I start my fat blog, you come on and I'll tell you all about it.
I love that.
Yeah.
This kind of science does rely on self-report, which means you have to trust the people to know what is best for them, which this book does not. But I do. Whether or not that's the moral or the ethical thing, I cannot believe in a God that would make someone want to kill themselves just for trying to act godly. That, having been there myself, that level of distress, that level of despair, I don't know if I believe in God. That is not from God. That is from some other bullshit.
Yeah.
The only science they cite is something called rapid onset gender dysphoria, which is a made-up thing made up by bigots.
Rapid onset gender dysphoria?
Yeah, it comes from parental reports, so not self-reported trans people, parents reporting of their kids, and they say, oh my God, my kid all of a sudden rapidly came out as trans to me, and they showed no sign of it beforehand, and they must have just acquired it randomly, or rapidly, or whatever. As a musical theater-loving, Care Bear enthusiast, flamboyant little faggot growing up, my parents were shocked when I came out. With love, parents are not good at recognizing signs of queerness in their kids, and this is even more true with bigoted parents.
Yeah. And some kids are pretty great at hiding it as
Yes.
well. Yeah.
They just hate trans people. This part's going to be a little bit rough. I'm going to pick out some quotes, but these are like, just listen to the language that they use when talking about trans people. Talking about following our heart. Is our heart good? Are our feelings right? Should we follow our desires? Don't murderers follow their heart? Isn't that what lying politicians and cheating spouses do? Isn't that what we do ourselves when we get angry and verbally lash out at someone?
I would never. What a leap.
Yeah.
I don't think I've ever thought about or considered murderers following their heart.
They're
not exactly
living
what's
their
happening.
truth. We recognize that there are various outside factors which some say influence them in embracing transgenderism. Some have pointed to sexual abuse as a trigger moment, others to pornography, others to the rejection and loneliness, others to desire for attention and acceptance. One woman said that after she was raped, she connected the experience so much with being a woman, she thought that if she morphed into the opposite sex, it would provide escape and relief.
That didn't happen.
My transgendered spirit gave me a false sense of self-value and wellness that twisted my deceived heart and its mind in its wicked tentacles, making me a true child of hell.
Did Peacock say that people would have a be transgender or have a surgery for attention?
Yes.
Okay. Is there going to be another page where he talks about the murder rates and the abuse and the hate crimes and the things? I mean, I'm sorry, I should have given a trigger warning, but for what attention?
Right. This is the thing that they feel so oppressed. Like, oh, it's cool to be queer. It is. First of all, it is cool to be queer, but not culturally.
Right. That's what I mean.
I don't love the fact that about half of the United States, I do not feel like I can safely travel to without some level of protection.
Right. Now, drag queens, on the other hand, that's for attention.
That is for attention.
Down at the biblical manhood.
I support them.
Me too.
They have a Q&A section because we can't do one of these fucking books without a Q&A. The question is, you speak about us not having the right visceral response to sexual immorality anymore. If the Bible calls it an abomination, should we be repulsed by transgenderism? The short answer is yes. Repulsed, abomination, visceral response. They talk about destroying the sin. They have the freedom and power to overcome the sin and to put it to death, but also remind them that they must do this, talking to trans people who want to be Christians. Parents at my child's school are encouraging their child to embrace an opposite gender identity. How should I handle this? This does not mean being nice and only telling people that God loves them and has a wonderful plan for their life. It means seeking to engage these parents in a respectful and Christ-like way.
Yeah, right.
Bullshit. And in doing so, making it clear that they are, in truth, harming their child terribly, sinning against the Creator, and must cease any form of encouraging the child to embrace the opposite sex appearance and identity. Ideally, this will lead to an opportunity to share Christ with them, the hope of every sinner.
What would you do, legit? Let's say you had a kid, or
Yeah.
you're babysitting a kid.
Let's say my younger brother Tyler was trans.
There we go. Yeah.
And a parent tried to tell my parents that they were hurting him so I would fully, and this is not hyperbole, if I was there, punch that person in the face.
Yeah. Not even if he was trans. They're saying even if he was just wearing a skirt.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Or had pink fingernails.
Had long hair.
Right. Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the last part of the book, this is how they start the section on biblical manhood, I believe. They have a testimony by a person who has detransitioned. Now, up top I will say, one, I absolutely have a bias of believing people at their word, which is something that is generally a good thing, sometimes gets me into trouble. Detransitioners are real. There are people who will engage in some level of gender transition, whether it be a social thing like going by a name or different pronouns, or even medical interventions like hormones or, to some cases, surgeries, and then decide not to continue doing that. These are all fairly unique, though. What does detransition mean? People pause or end their transition for a number of reasons. A study done by the National Center for Transgender Equality in the United States in 2015 found that 8% of trans people surveyed reported some kind of detransition. Those in that 8% number listed a number of reasons for doing so, including facing too much harassment, having trouble getting a job, pressure from a parent or spouse or other family members. So a lot of people, quote unquote, detransition for contextual reasons, not because they're not actually trans, but because the social environment is not safe for them to do so.
Right.
Still, there are people who transition and realize it is wrong for them. This does indeed happen. I am not trying to deny it. Even then, though, that process doesn't have to be some repentance of sin or even inherently traumatic. I know a number of people who've played around with the various levels of transitioning before finding a more long-term gender expression. You don't have to have full-on, like, crippling gender dysphoria to want to try out some estrogen. That can be fine. And then you can try and be like, that's not for me. As long as you do it in an informed way, it's not morally a problem, and it doesn't have to be traumatic. I am not inherently doubting the transition story mentioned here. I hold room for the possibility that this is 100% true, and it still doesn't change my mind at what it means to be trans or how to treat trans people clinically, because the standards of care for trans people go very slow and it's all about informed consent. But I will also name there's a real possibility that this person is just a grifter. They talk about like being trans is a popular thing. If I am ever in a bind or if fascism takes hold in America, I could very easily repent of my sins of queerness and I'd get a talk show. I'd be able to testify to Congress. I'd get a book deal after book deal. I'd get a podcast that actually pays me money.
I mean, this podcast pays me money.
In snacks and alcohol. There are people who have detransitioned in the United States who have testified to Congress multiple times. I don't want to go through this person's whole story because it is sad in a number of ways, but they tried to, I'll give you some highlights. They try at first to say like, I was continually practicing self-stimulation, which I discovered on my own when I was 11 or 12. So like I was inordinately sexually promiscuous by masturbating. 11 and 12 is a normal age to masturbate. I entered pornography use at this time. My dad owned a drugstore and I'd steal magazines off the rack. Okay, sure.
Yeah.
That's also fine. When I was about 12, an older male teenager sexually abused me one time. That's just dropped there. It's not talked about. It's not expanded upon. It's just thrown in. I got married because I didn't believe any woman would ever love me. So I got married for the wrong reasons. The marriage fell apart and he started going to a club called Illusions. Illusions, quote, was a club for men who were transvestites or transsexuals who could live out their perversions in the privacy and secrecy of a closed club. During the years I was present in this club, I received a popularity that I'd never had while living as a man, even being crowned Empress the Sixth of Illusions. Pause. I couldn't find any proof that this happened, but like every fifth drag show was called Illusions at one point. Right. So it's like, it's really hard to tell. Whatever.
Wait, what's the funniest name of a drag club or gay bar that you've ever had?
Funniest? I don't know. There's a bar in New York just called Cox.
That's pretty good.
Editing Jake here. Oh my god, I can't believe I got this wrong. The bar is called The Cock. Not Cox. It's The Cock. It's a legendary gay bar in New York City. I love this bar. I can't believe I got it wrong. Am I even gay? Anyway, back to the show. What about you?
Well, there used to be the manhole.
I love the manhole. That is very funny.
And then I think the funniest was I was in West Virginia one time and I went to a gay bar and it was called Twice as Nice. And I ordered a glass of white wine, which was served to me in a beer stein with ice and a straw. It was $2.
That's awesome. So this person whose detransition testimony we're reading, the transgendered spirit gave me a false sense of self-value and wellness. We talked about this, the child of hell one. My life went from believing in Jesus as a child to believing only in myself as an adult. I underwent gender reassignment surgeries and eventually realized I'd suppressed the truth, the charade that cost me everything that I truly loved in life. Before the end of the year, I cut my hair and began to live life as a man that God had made me to be. Quote, it hasn't been easy. I continue to deal with debilitating depression, which developed during those years, meaning after detransitioned. That sounds like you're actually trans.
Yeah.
Debilitating depression that you continually struggle with?
Yeah.
We've talked about before, like what makes something clinically diagnosable or not. And one of the like key defining factors is like, does it cause you clinically significant distress? I don't know this person. I don't know the story. I don't know how much is real. It sounds like you're trans.
Yeah. Also, one thing I tell my clients is that I say this about the internet, but I think it's just true about anything. Like, you can find proof of anything. like on the internet. Like for my clients with health anxiety, I'm like, yeah, you will find a case of this, right? For sure. But that does not mean that this is likely or common or even, it's like the 0.1%, right? Like, sure, you can find the person who this has happened to, but that does not make that, like they're ignoring the 99% of people that hasn't happened to, right? And also, this person sounds trans.
Yes, this person sounds horribly depressed.
Yeah. And not because they're trans.
Because they're not being their trans self.
Right.
So that's the end of the book. I have one note before we totally wrap up because we are coming up to the 2-hour mark on recording.
I'm so sorry. I couldn't.
It is mostly me. I appreciate everything you contribute. The note I want to end on, or the last thing that I really have to say, is a note on beauty. If I wasn't so angry, and I feel like rightfully angry, I would be really sad for these people that they cannot see the beauty in the world around them. It is actively a joy and a continual source of wonder that I have when I get to witness a trans person become who they are. Divorce can be hurtful for sure, but it can also be an incredible step towards someone making healthy boundaries and healthy relationships. I'm not a Buddhist, but I find value, wisdom, and beauty in its teachings, like that pain is an inevitable part of life, but suffering, the non-acceptance of pain, is optional. I like John Waters movies. They are crude and gross and beautiful in their own fucked up way. There is beauty in the world around us, even and especially the hard stuff. We don't need to glorify pain and suffering to see resilience and care. If I'm living a life of sin, if Owen and Gavin Peacock are 100% correct, I still see beauty in my life. After we finish recording tonight, I'm going to go home to my partner. We're going to eat food, talk about our day, probably get a nice good long hug after this. I wish they could see the beauty in the world too, instead of seeing every single thing as a threat or as fallen or as a reminder of Satan. In conclusion, these are the type of people who will be writing legal policy for the United States and the world if Trump wins next week. People who demand women submit to men, who think your humanity is defined by your reproductive ability. People who hate queer people and use incendiary and violent language against trans people. They do this now. Imagine what they will do when they actually have power. These are the same people who funded Uganda's bill to criminalize homosexuality by punishment of death. I'm not saying that that will happen here. However, it could happen here. And if you don't think so, you are lying to yourself. Also, and I cannot emphasize enough, how much these assholes go out of their way to pick on queer people. Most queer people and trans people I know just want to live their life. Play Pokemon or D&D with their friends, go to a bar. The ones pushing an agenda are Dobson and these fuckers. Importantly, though, their scariness is not a result of their strength. Like, Brooke, you were saying, this idea of suppressing and oppressing women because men fear their reproductive abilities, their ability to create life, which is an incredible thing, does not make them strong. It shows they're weak. These fuckers are whiny, weak assholes. They have to scream and threaten and hurt others to conform because they know no other way. That makes them dangerous, for sure, but it also shows their fragility. They are fundamentally dumb and evil, and they are beatable. Brooke, I hate James Dobson.
Jake, I hate James Dobson. I hate Gavin Peacock, but I love biblical man.
I'm going to go home and show my boyfriend my biblical manhood. Manhood of biblical proportions.
I'm going to go home and do whatever the fuck I want because I do not have to serve any man.
Fucking men. Readers, we'll be out next week, actually, with a bonus episode the day before the election to talk with you. But please take care of yourselves. It's scary out there. Drink some water. Hug a dog. And we'll see you next week.
Deep breaths.
Woo!
Ooh, that was a big one. I hope the next one isn't this big, Jake.
I Hate James Dobson is Labor of Love. Written, recorded, edited, and produced by me, Jake. I'm honored to be joined by my amazing co-host, Brooke. If you're enjoying the show, please consider rating and reviewing it. And if you want to connect with us more, you can find us on TikTok, Instagram, and YouTube at I Hate James Dobson, and on Twitter at I Hate JDobs. If you want to email us, you can do so at ihatejamesdobson@gmail.com. Special thanks to Drew, Lindsay, DJ, and Jack. Our theme music is by Mood Maze, and the song is called Trendsetter. Thank you for enjoying our show.
You have to accept, as a woman, you have to accept being thought of as a bitch if you want to defend yourself or have any boundaries, right? And otherwise, it's like you really see it, like when women sort of freeze, right? Or don't know what to do when they're in a position where they have to say no to a man. Not all women, but a lot. It's so like in the socialization, like our blood of socialization, right?
Yeah.
Oof.